So working with social capital in order to bring about urban revitalization. This is more of an analysis process that you can use different manual aggregates of social networks in order to bring about urban revitalization. So I want to talk about two individual projects that are actually about two different upstate New York cities that are both Rust Belt cities, Rochester and Utica, New York. So historically, they are connected, Rochester being on the left and Utica being on the right. They are connected through the Erie Canal, which allowed for a huge economic boom, population boom, industrialization. Sadly, that failed once the railroads came in and sort of made the Erie Canal sort of useless, very much obsolete. So with that came a lot of downfall, as you can see, vacant homes, population loss. A lot of lower income communities are populating these cities. In the case of Utica, which is the upper row of photos, they have a huge amount of population loss, but they're also having this growth in refugees because you can buy a house for $7,000 US, which is extremely cheap. So, however, even though we have these extremely negative conditions, we also have these positive conditions, which are communities that want to bring about good things. So you have these environmental nonprofits that are trying to promote agriculture, both in education and also promoting different jobs, as well as giving food to children of lower income families that don't have very good nutritional practices, which is very common in both Utica and Rochester. So the specific term that I want to talk to you about and sort of give a clear definition of what I see as social capital is this collective communal currency that is built upon social trust, identification, as well as the bond that you feel within your community. So it's a lot of that ownership that we've been talking about today at the presentations. So these places that we build social capital are what I'd like to call positive hubs of interaction. So they're your recreation centers like theaters, they're your public parks, they're your schools, as well as nonprofit organizations and religious institutions. On the opposite end, you have negative hubs of interaction, which are your vacant factories, group brownfields, buildings in disrepair, which is quite common in these cities, as well as unmanaged green space that has no sort of identification of who owns it and who's managing it. And of course, crime. So in the case of Utica, I worked on a group project with two other landscape architecture students at Cornell, and we individually called every single church to see how many people went every week in order to figure out our frequency, and we called schools to see how many people attended and try to figure out what the in each individual goal of the nonprofits were so that we could understand exactly how the social structure worked within these cities. So we put down each different case. As you can see on the left, these are your negative hubs. So there's a lot of crime happening in the center as well as vacant lots. There are over 400 vacant lots in Utica. Those are houses, those are industrial buildings, those are just green spaces with nothing on them. And then you have your positive hubs, which are sort of equally spread out amongst the city, but there is a very much dense center, which is the main street of Utica. So from here, we created an equation, which seems kind of weird, but we were trying to give a quantitative amount to a quality, which is sort of hard to understand and explain, but at the same time, it makes sense that a green space that is beautiful and has a clear definition of what it is and where it is a part of the community and how people interact and utilize it has more value than a brown space that has a fence around it and has no use. So we took a quarter mile and we gave values to all these different conditions. And a quarter mile was our standard for influence. So each vacant lot had its own equation and value given to it from this. And we got spot elevations. So you have our negative spot elevations and our positive. And we made a sort of arbitrary field of influence. So how far that influence is, whether it's so great or so negative, or it's just sort of in the middle. And from this, we took our spot elevations and we figured, well, we want to see how far that influence spreads out, because obviously it's not just one point and it just sits within a mile of the city. Rather, it can be felt with throughout the city. So we made topography maps. So the topography didn't necessarily show how the negative and the positive started to interact, but it started to show how far negativity is felt throughout a city or positivity is. And so that led to a net charge topography map, which is conceptual in its state, but it pretty much tells us these are the areas, the pink areas being the most negative in the city, and the blue being the most positive parts of the city. So like in that bottom corner there, that's actually a community college that has a lot of free programming for people to get classes. The lower red spots are more of the industrial buildings that are no longer used. So from this, there was a flow chart of how do you manage these things. It was more of a system rather than a specific design for a specific piece of land. Rather, it was a whole system of how can you rethink the economy, the social structures, the planning structures, the influence government has on these lands, as well as how can you work with the people in order to make this happen. So using the existing nonprofit organizations and their goals, we put them into our flow chart and said, you can be helpful here in promoting awareness and gathering funds and giving this great community feeling that Utica has for these refugees or new people living here, as well as the existing community. So this was very much an in-depth, very quantitative method, but it was very much a pulled-back view of the entire city. In contrast, there's Rochester, which was a more recent project that I worked on individually, which is a smaller site, and it's a historic district in Rochester, New York. And it has a beautiful waterfall that used to be the source of fuel for flour mills, as well as other industrial buildings. But now it's pretty much a dead space. Their factories have closed. All that's left now is a brewery and waterfalls, but no access to the water. Rather, you only walk across an old bridge. So from different websites, I was able to gather information, like what are the types of programming that exist? Maybe there are geocaches on the site, and there are, as well as what does the DEC of New York City, the Department of Environmental Conservation, tell us are the different types of ecological communities? What can we utilize? What can we sort of highlight in a different sort of design? So all these different information you can get publicly through different websites. Then the sociability of the landscape, using Foursquare check-ins to see where people move about, where do they sit, where are the places that you can go to. This is supposed to be an entertainment district, but rather it's quite empty. If you look at the check-ins, there's this dramatic difference in ratios where you'll have 2 people check into an overlook that's for the falls on the right side of the water, but then you'll have over 4,000 people checking into the baseball field. That's the lower giant bubble. So it's helping to understand where visitors come into play, because the community outside is lower income. I'm guessing they don't check into every place that they go to. But this helps us figure out where visitors are coming in and sort of immigrating into the community. So in contrast, of course, we have our social deterrents, which are the crimes. There's a lot of vehicle break-ins, which sort of makes people not want to park there and participate in all the entertainment availabilities. But it also sort of opens up to this dialogue of, well, what happens once you get rid of this vacancy, this lack of population? What happens when you bring people in? Will it change the crime, or will it bring about more? So there's obviously this social conflict within the city in that sense, which brought about the opportunities and constraints both of the physical landscape, but also of the social landscape, which brought about a series of phases that could happen, and each one, I know it's not legible, each bar is for a different part of the site that says the different nonprofits that can work with it, the different community potentials that it has. For example, there is these old historic buildings that are the blue on the top corner. They are meant to be demolished, but they actually could be a community resource and being a community center, which this area of the community lacks. So ultimately, you would have this beautiful master plan that would bring everybody together and hopefully bring about that social community that everybody wishes for in these areas.